The sound of splintering wood tore through the crisp evening air as the stagecoach careened off the rocky path, the horses' panicked whinnies echoing across the rugged California landscape. Lydia Nelson clutched the leather strap above her head, knuckles white, as her body was thrown violently against the coach wall. Time slowed in that terrible moment, the other passengers' screams, the driver's desperate curses, and then the sickening sensation of falling as the coach toppled over the edge of the narrow mountain pass. Dust billowed around the wreckage as silence fell over the scene. Lydia's consciousness wavered, her vision blurring as warm blood trickled down her temple. The last thing she remembered before darkness claimed her was the distant sound of hoofbeats approaching and a silhouette framed against the setting sun. When Lydia's eyes fluttered open, the world was bathed in the orange glow of a small fire. Pain radiated through her body, most acutely from her left leg and ribs. She tried to sit up but gasped at the sharp stab of agony that shot through her side. "Easy there, madam," a deep voice cautioned. "You've taken quite a tumble." A man moved into her field of vision, his features gradually coming into focus. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with a sun-weathered face partially shadowed by the brim of his worn Stetson. His eyes, however, were startlingly gentle, a warm amber that reflected the firelight. "The stagecoach," Lydia managed to whisper, her throat parched and raw. "The others." The stranger's expression tightened. 2 passengers made it out with minor injuries. "The driver's pretty banged up, but he'll live. They're making their way to Independence with another traveler who came upon us." He paused. "You were unconscious, your leg's broken, and you've got some nasty cuts. They couldn't move you safely. So they left me behind." Lydia tried to keep the panic from her voice. "They left you with me," he corrected, kneeling beside her. "Name's Kieran Zane. I was tracking some wild horses when I heard the crash." Lydia attempted to shift into a more comfortable position but winced at the movement. "I'm Lydia Nelson," she replied, noticing for the first time that her leg was splinted with what looked like pieces of the stagecoach and bound with strips of fabric. Her arm bore a carefully wrapped bandage, and she could feel another around her ribs beneath her torn blouse. "You've bandaged me," she observed, a mixture of gratitude and embarrassment washing over her. Kieran nodded, his expression solemn. "Had to. You were bleeding pretty badly." He handed her a canteen. "Here, drink something." The water was cool and refreshing against her parched lips. As she drank, Lydia took stock of her surroundings. They were in a small clearing, sheltered by a rocky overhang. The remains of the stagecoach lay scattered several yards away, a stark reminder of how close she'd come to death. "We're about 5 miles from Independence," Kieran explained, reading her thoughts. "I'll take you there at first light, but moving you in the dark would be too dangerous." "You're going to stay with me until dawn?" Lydia asked, oddly comforted by the thought despite her circumstances. "Yes, madam," he replied simply, returning to the fire to stir something in a small pot. "Hope you don't mind rabbit stew. Not exactly what you'd get at a fancy San Francisco restaurant, but it'll keep your strength up." Despite everything, Lydia found herself smiling faintly. "I'm sure it's wonderful, Mr. Zane." "Kieran," he corrected, the corners of his eyes crinkling slightly. "Kieran," she echoed, the name feeling strangely intimate on her tongue. As he spooned the stew into a tin cup for her, Lydia studied him more carefully. His clothes were dusty, but well kept: a faded blue shirt, worn leather vest, and denim pants tucked into scuffed boots. A gun belt hung low on his hips, the handle of his revolver worn smooth from use. He moved with the easy confidence of a man accustomed to the harsh realities of frontier life. "What brings you to these parts, Miss Nelson?" he asked, helping her sit up enough to eat. Lydia winced as she adjusted, the stew's savory aroma momentarily distracting her from the pain. "I'm heading to Independence to take over my late uncle's newspaper, the Independence Chronicle." Kieran's eyebrows rose slightly. "Old Harmon Nelson was your uncle? I knew him, good man. Fair." He paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. "Not many women running newspapers out here." "Not many women running anything out here," Lydia countered, a touch of defiance in her voice. "But the Chronicle is mine now, and I intend to make it work." The ghost of a smile played across Kieran's lips. "I don't doubt that for a second, Miss Nelson." As the night deepened around them, Lydia learned that Kieran worked as a horse trainer at the White River Ranch just outside Independence. He had a way with even the wildest mustangs, a talent that had earned him respect in a town often wary of newcomers. He'd been in the area for 3 years, having drifted west from Texas after the war. And before that, Lydia asked, curiosity getting the better of her. Kieran's expression closed slightly. "Lot of things best left in the past, Miss Nelson." There was something in his tone that discouraged further questions, a shadow of memories he wasn't ready to share. Lydia understood that everyone who came west carried ghosts of one kind or another. She had her own reasons for leaving Boston behind. The pain in her leg throbbed persistently, but Kieran's gentle care made it bearable. He changed her bandages with practiced hands, apologizing when she couldn't suppress a gasp of pain. When he finished, he draped his own coat over her for warmth. "Try to get some sleep," he advised, moving to the other side of the fire. "Dawn's still a few hours off." Despite her discomfort and the strangeness of her situation, exhaustion soon pulled Lydia toward sleep. The last thing she saw before her eyes closed was Kieran's silhouette against the star-filled sky, keeping watch over her like some frontier guardian angel. She dreamed of falling, the terrifying sensation of the stagecoach plummeting only to be caught by strong arms that held her secure against the chaos. When she jolted awake, breath coming in short gasps, Kieran was instantly beside her. "Just a dream," he murmured, his voice low and calming. "You're safe now." His hand rested briefly on her shoulder, the touch surprisingly tender for such a weathered man. In the flickering firelight, with the vast wilderness surrounding them, that small gesture of comfort meant everything. "Tell me about Independence," Lydia requested, knowing sleep would elude her now. Kieran settled back, adding wood to the fire. "Small place, but growing. The silver mines brought folks initially, but there's good grazing land too. Ranchers, miners, shopkeepers' usual mix. Not too lawless compared to some towns I've seen." He poked at the embers. "Your uncle's paper was the heart of it, though. Folks counted on Harmon to print the truth, even when it wasn't convenient." "That's what I want to continue," Lydia said softly. "A paper that serves the community, that matters." Kieran studied her across the flames. "What brought you west, really? Most Boston ladies aren't eager to run a frontier newspaper." The question caught Lydia off guard. Perhaps it was the pain or the strange intimacy of their situation, but she found herself answering truthfully. "I was engaged to be married," she began, her fingers twisting in the blanket. "A suitable match, according to my parents, the son of my father's business partner. Charles was charming, respected." Her voice hardened. "And a complete fraud. He was embezzling from both families, gambling away fortunes. When it was discovered, there was a terrible scandal." "You were disgraced by association," Kieran surmised. Lydia nodded. "Even though I knew nothing about it." Doors closed. Whispers followed. "When I received the letter about Uncle Harmon's death and his bequest of the newspaper to me, it seemed like Providence, a chance to start fresh where no one knew my name or my history. And now here you are, with a broken leg in the middle of nowhere," Kieran observed, a note of wry humor in his voice. Despite everything, Lydia laughed, a genuine sound that surprised them both. "Not exactly the grand entrance I had planned." Kieran's smile transformed his face, softening the hard lines carved by sun and wind. "Independence-like stories, Miss Nelson. You'll be the talk of the town before your legs even healed." "Wonderful," she replied dryly, but found herself smiling back. The night wore on, filled with conversation that flowed more easily than either expected. Kieran told her about the town's characters, Mayor Hollister with his grand plans for expansion, Doc Pearson, who was more often paid in chickens than cash, and Mrs. Abernathy, whose boarding house served the best apple pie west of the Mississippi. "She'll likely take you in while you recover," Kieran said. "The newspaper office has living quarters, but you'll need help for a while with that leg." The reminder of her injury sobered Lydia. She had arrived with such plans and determination, only to find herself dependent on the kindness of strangers from the very start. "I'm grateful for your help," she said quietly. "I'm not sure what would have happened if you hadn't come along." Kieran's expression grew serious. Mountain lions have been prowling these foothills lately. It's fortunate for both of us that I was tracking those horses." The implication hung in the air between them, unspoken but understood. He had possibly saved her life, not just by bandaging her wounds but by his very presence through the dangerous night. As the fire burned low, Lydia found herself fighting to keep her eyes open. The pain medication Kieran had given her, some herbal concoction from his saddlebag, was taking effect, dulling the sharp edges of her discomfort. "Rest," he encouraged. "I'll be right here." There was something in his voice, a promise that went beyond the words themselves, that allowed Lydia to surrender to sleep once more. When she next opened her eyes, the eastern sky was lightening, the first pale streaks of dawn painting the horizon. Kieran was saddling his horse, a sturdy palomino that watched his master with alert eyes. He had already packed their small camp, leaving only the bedroll where Lydia lay. "Morning," he greeted, noticing she was awake. "How's the pain?" "Manageable," Lydia answered, though in truth her entire body ached fiercely. "Is it time to go?" Kieran nodded, approaching to help her sit up. "I'll fashion a travois to pull behind my horse. It won't be comfortable, but it'll get you to town without jostling that leg too much." Using pieces of the wrecked stagecoach and branches from nearby trees, Kieran constructed a simple but sturdy travois. He worked efficiently, his movements suggesting he'd done this before, perhaps during the war, Lydia thought, remembering his brief mention of that time. When all was ready, he knelt beside her. "This is going to hurt," he warned gently. "No way around it." Lydia steeled herself, nodding her consent. With careful movements, Kieran slid one arm under her knees and the other behind her back, lifting her as if she weighed nothing. Still, the movement sent waves of pain through her injured leg and ribs, drawing an involuntary cry from her lips. "I'm sorry," he murmured, his face close to hers as he carried her to the travois. The warmth of his breath against her cheek was distracting enough that, for a moment, she almost forgot the pain. He settled her as comfortably as possible on the travois, padding it with his bedroll and covering her with blankets against the morning chill. Their eyes met briefly as he tucked the last blanket around her shoulders, a look that passed between them like a current, unexpected and powerful. "Ready?" he asked, his voice rougher than before. "Yes," Lydia replied, though she wasn't entirely sure what she was agreeing to. As the sun continued its ascent, casting long shadows across the rugged landscape, Kieran mounted his horse and they began the slow journey toward independence. The travois bumped and swayed over the uneven ground, each jolt sending fresh pain through Lydia's injuries. She bit her lip to keep from crying out, unwilling to show weakness. Kieran glanced back frequently, his concern evident. "Not much farther," he encouraged after they had traveled for perhaps an hour. "See that smoke on the horizon? That's independence." Lydia squinted against the brightening day, making out the faint smudges of chimney smoke in the distance. The sight should have brought relief, civilization, medical care, the beginning of her new life, but instead she felt an odd reluctance. Once they reached town, this strange, intimate interlude with Kieran Zane would end. "Tell me about the Chronicle," she requested, partly to distract herself from the pain and partly to postpone that inevitable conclusion. Kieran was silent for a moment, as if choosing his words carefully. "It's a good paper. Small operation, just your uncle and a young assistant, Timothy Cooper. Prints once a week unless there's breaking news." He paused. Harmon wasn't afraid to print hard truths, which didn't always make him popular with certain elements in town. Something in his tone caught Lydia's attention. "Certain elements, independence is changing," Kieran explained. "The railroad's coming, at least that's the plan. There's money to be made in land speculation, water rights, construction contracts." Your uncle was asking questions about who stood to profit and how. "And that made enemies," Lydia surmised. Kieran glanced back at her, his expression unreadable. "Just be careful who you trust, Miss Nelson. Not everyone will welcome the Chronicle continuing in your uncle's tradition." The warning settled over Lydia like a shadow, reminding her that the West could be as dangerous in its politics as in its wilderness. But she hadn't come all this way to be intimidated. "I'm not easily frightened, Mr. Zane," she stated firmly. His lips quirked into a half smile. I'm beginning to see that. As they drew closer to Independence, details of the town emerged: a church steeple, the larger buildings of Main Street, corrals and stables on the outskirts. It was smaller than Lydia had imagined, but larger than many frontier settlements, with an air of permanence in its wooden sidewalks and painted storefronts. People began to notice their approach, stopping to stare at the unusual sight of Kieran leading his horse with a travois carrying a battered woman. A crowd quickly gathered, voices rising in curiosity and concern. "It's Zane. Who's that with him?" "Must be a survivor from the Stagecoach crash. Word came in last night." Someone fetch Doc Pearson. A short, balding man pushed through the crowd, medical bag in hand. His sharp eyes assessed Lydia immediately. "Another passenger from the crash, eh? Let's get her to my office." He glanced at Kieran. "Good work bringing her in, Zane. Looks like you kept her alive." "She did most of the staying alive herself, Doc," Kieran replied, dismounting. As hands reached to help transfer Lydia from the travois to a makeshift stretcher, she suddenly gripped Kieran's arm. "Thank you," she said softly, her eyes meeting his, "for everything." Something flickered in his gaze, regret perhaps, or something more complex. "Just doing what needed doing, Miss Nelson." His voice was gruff, but his hand briefly covered hers. "Welcome to Independence." Then she was being lifted away, carried toward a whitewashed building with a sign proclaiming Dr. Isaiah Pearson, physician and surgeon. The last glimpse she had of Kieran was his tall figure standing in the street, watching her go, his expression unreadable beneath the shadow of his hat. The next several hours passed in a blur of pain and strange faces. Dr. Pearson confirmed what Kieran had diagnosed: a broken leg, cracked ribs, and various cuts and bruises. He praised the initial treatment, noting that the splint had been expertly applied. "That cowboy saved you from a world of trouble," the doctor commented as he rewrapped her ribs. "Could have lost that leg if it had been set wrong. Zane knows his business when it comes to injuries." "How did he learn?" Lydia asked, curious despite her discomfort. The doctor's hands paused momentarily. "War teaches hard lessons, Miss Nelson. Zane was a cavalry scout, saw things no man should have to see." He resumed his work. "But that's his story to tell if he chooses." After her injuries were properly treated, Lydia was indeed taken to Mrs. Abernathy's boarding house as Kieran had predicted. The motherly widow fussed over her, installing her in the best ground floor room and plying her with tea and sympathy. "Such a terrible welcome to our town," Mrs. Abernathy clucked, arranging pillows behind Lydia's back. "But you're safe now, dear. And once you're on your feet, we'll help you get settled at the Chronicle. Everyone's been wondering who would take over after poor Harmon passed." "Has the paper continued publishing?" Lydia asked. Young Timothy's kept it going, simple like, mostly announcements and advertisements. "The boy tries, but he's no editor." Mrs. Abernathy smoothed the bed cover. "Folk have missed Harmon's editorials, his reporting. He had a way of making you think." "I hope to continue that tradition," Lydia said, suppressing a yawn. The doctor's laudanum was taking effect, making her eyelids heavy. Mrs. Abernathy patted her hand. "Rest now, dear. There'll be time enough for newspapers when you're stronger." As Lydia drifted toward sleep, her thoughts turned to Kieran. She wondered if he would visit, if their paths would cross again in this small town. The memory of his gentle hands tending her wounds, of their conversations beneath the star-filled sky, followed her into dreams. She awoke to late afternoon sunlight slanting through lace curtains. For a moment, disoriented by the unfamiliar surroundings, she expected to see a campfire and Kieran's watchful figure. Instead, a young man with earnest eyes and ink-stained fingers sat beside her bed, practically vibrating with nervous energy. "Miss Nelson, you're awake." "I'm Timothy Cooper. I work at the Chronicle." "Worked for your uncle, that is." "Still work there, of course, but now I suppose I work for you if you'll have me. Which I hope you will, because I've been trying to keep the paper going, but it's been awful hard with just me, and I'm not much of a writer compared to Mr. Nelson. But I've done my best. Truly I have, Mr. Cooper," Lydia interrupted gently. "I'm very pleased to meet you." The young man, barely 20, she guessed, flushed and ducked his head. "Sorry, madam, I talk too much when I'm nervous. Everyone says so." "No need for nerves," Lydia assured him. I'm grateful you've kept the Chronicle running. I'll need your help even more now with this. She gestured to her splinted leg. Timothy's expression brightened. I'll do anything you need, Miss Nelson. I've brought the latest edition and some of Mr. Nelson's files that I thought you might want to see when you're feeling up to it. He produced a newspaper and a leather portfolio from beside his chair. Lydia accepted them eagerly, despite her fatigue. The Independence Chronicle was smaller than she'd imagined, just 4 pages of closely set type. The masthead was simply designed but dignified, promising all the news fit to print in Independence and environs since 1855. As she scanned the front page, filled mostly with local announcements and national news reprinted from larger papers, Lydia's professional eye noted both the publication's potential and its current limitations. The writing was straightforward, but lacked the spark of compelling journalism. "You've done admirably, Mr. Cooper," she said sincerely. "Keeping a newspaper running is no small feat." Timothy beamed at the praise. "I've tried, Miss Nelson, but folks have been asking when we'll start printing real news again, investigations and opinions like your uncle did." "Soon," Lydia promised, though privately she wondered how she would manage with her injuries. "Tell me, what are the biggest stories in Independence right now?" Timothy leaned forward eagerly. "Well, there's the railroad, of course. Pacific Western has surveyors marking routes, and there's a big fight about whether the line will run through town or bypass us altogether." He lowered his voice. "Mr. Hollister, he's our mayor, has been meeting with railroad men. Some say he's got land deals already arranged, banking on where the station might be built. And my uncle was investigating this," Lydia asked, remembering Kieran's warning. Timothy's expression grew serious. "Yes, madam. He was following the money, asking who owned what parcels and how they came to own them. Some powerful folks weren't happy with his questions." "Do you think?" Lydia hesitated, the implication almost too terrible to voice. "Was my uncle's death truly natural?" Timothy's eyes widened. "Doctor said it was his heart, Miss Nelson, but—" He glanced toward the door, then back at Lydia. "The night before he died, a man came to the office. They argued something fierce. Your uncle wouldn't tell me what about, but he was real shaken after." The revelation settled like a cold weight in Lydia's stomach. Had her uncle been threatened? Could his death have been more than coincidence? These questions would need answers, but she was in no condition to pursue them now. "Thank you for telling me, Mr. Cooper," she said carefully. "For now, let's focus on getting the next edition ready. I may be bedridden, but my mind is perfectly functional." For the next hour, they discussed the newspaper's operation circulation, advertisers, printing schedule. Timothy proved to be a font of information, compensating for his youth with enthusiasm and a genuine love for the newspaper business. By the time Mrs. Abernathy shooed him out, insisting Lydia needed rest, they had outlined a plan for the coming week's edition. Alone again, Lydia found her thoughts returning to the mystery surrounding her uncle's death and to Kieran's warning about trust. She opened the leather portfolio Timothy had brought, finding it filled with her uncle's notes and half-written articles. Most concerned ordinary town business, but one folder was labeled simply Railroad and contained maps, property records, and scribbled observations. A knock at the door interrupted her perusal. "Come in," she called, expecting Mrs. Abernathy with dinner. Instead, Kieran Zane filled the doorframe, hat in hand. He looked different in town, clothes a clean shirt, pressed pants, boots that gleamed with polish but no less imposing. His hair, damp from a recent washing, curled slightly at the nape of his neck. "Miss Nelson," he greeted, remaining in the doorway. "Thought I'd check how you're faring." Lydia was suddenly acutely aware of her disheveled appearance and the intimate setting of her bedroom, even with the propriety of her invalid status. "Mr. Zane, please come in." He stepped inside but maintained a respectful distance, standing rather than taking the chair Timothy had vacated. "Doc says you'll mend well enough with time." "Thanks to your care," Lydia acknowledged. "Dr. Pearson said your field medicine likely saved my leg." Kieran's expression remained impassive, but she thought she detected a flicker of pleasure at the praise. "Just used what I learned the hard way." His gaze fell on the newspaper and open portfolio beside her. "I see Cooper's brought you up to speed." "He's been very helpful." Lydia confirmed, studying Kieran curiously. In the soft lamplight of the boarding house, with the sounds of town life filtering through the window, he seemed both more and less familiar than the man who had tended her wounds beneath the stars. Though I'm learning my uncle may have made some powerful enemies with his reporting, Kieran's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Harmon believed a newspaper's job was to print the truth, regardless of who it inconvenienced. Not everyone shares that view. Did you know him well? Lydia asked. Well enough to respect him, Kieran replied, his tone suggesting deeper connection than the words themselves. Your uncle helped me when I first came to Independence, when others weren't so welcoming to a former Confederate. This revelation surprised Lydia. You fought for the South. Texas rode with the Confederacy, he said simply, neither pride nor apology in his voice. I was a scout, not much of a believer in the cause, but that distinction didn't matter to some folk here. But it mattered to my uncle, Lydia surmised. Kieran nodded. He judged men by their actions, not their past. He hesitated, then added, I owed him. That's partly why I came tonight. If you need anything while you're recovering, anything at all, you just send word to White River Ranch. The offer seemed to cost him something in the saying, as if extending himself this way didn't come easily. Lydia was touched by the gesture, sensing its significance. Thank you, Kieran, she said softly, deliberately using his first name as she had during those hours by the campfire. His eyes met hers, holding for a moment longer than strictly proper. You should rest, he said finally, taking a step back. Town'll be buzzing with visitors soon enough once word spreads you're awake. Independence loves nothing more than fresh gossip and a new face. As if to prove his point, another knock sounded at the door. Mrs. Abernathy entered with a tray, her eyebrows rising at the sight of Kieran. Mr. Zane, she greeted, her tone suggesting this was an unexpected development. I didn't realize Miss Nelson had visitors. Just leaving, Mrs. Abernathy, Kieran assured her, donning his hat. Evening, Miss Nelson, madam. With a slight nod to both women, he departed. Mrs. Abernathy watched him go, then turned to Lydia with undisguised curiosity. I didn't know you were acquainted with Kieran Zane. He saved my life after the Stagecoach crash, Lydia explained, accepting the tray of fragrant stew and fresh bread. Did he now? Mrs. Abernathy's expression was thoughtful as she arranged Lydia's dinner. Well, that's not so surprising, I suppose. Zane's always been one to help where it's needed, for all his keeping to himself. She busied herself adjusting pillows. Handsome man, too, though a bit old for such a confirmed bachelor. Must be 35 if he's a day. Lydia recognized the gentle probing for what it was the beginning of town gossip and steered the conversation to safer topics. Tell me about Independence, Mrs. Abernathy. I want to understand the community the Chronicle serves. The diversion worked. Mrs. Abernathy settled into the chair and proceeded to provide a detailed account of the town's history, prominent citizens, and current affairs. Her perspective was invaluable, offering insights that went beyond Timothy's earnest but limited understanding of local dynamics. Mayor Hollister fancies himself the man who will bring independence into the modern age, Mrs. Abernathy explained, her tone suggesting skepticism. Railroad, telegraph, perhaps even electric lights someday. Progress, he calls it. And you disagree. Lydia prompted, hearing the reservation in the woman's voice. Mrs. Abernathy sighed. Progress has its place, but I've seen enough boom towns turn to ghost towns when the mines play out or the railroad chooses another route. Folk get greedy, make bad decisions. Your uncle understood that, wrote about the need for sustainable growth, not just quick profit. These land deals Timothy mentioned, they concern you. They concern anyone who cares about this town's future, Mrs. Abernathy confirmed. Property changing hands at curious prices. Parcels that were worthless suddenly selling for fortunes, and no one seems to know exactly where the railroad will run, except perhaps the mayor and his friends. She patted Lydia's hand. But that's enough serious talk for your first day. You need rest, not town troubles. After Mrs. Abernathy departed, Lydia returned to her uncle's notes, reading until her eyes grew heavy. The patterns emerging were troubling suggestions of insider information being used to purchase land along potential railroad routes. mysterious business partnerships forming between longtime rivals, and increasing pressure on smaller property owners to sell. Her uncle had been asking the right questions, and now Lydia wondered if those questions had cost him his life. The next morning brought a stream of visitors, town officials offering formal welcomes, curious neighbors bearing gifts of food and flowers, and businessmen thinly disguising their interest in how she planned to run the Chronicle. Mayor Hollister himself appeared mid-morning, a florid man whose expansive gestures couldn't quite disguise the calculation in his eyes. "Tragic about the Stagecoach, Miss Nelson, simply tragic," he declared, occupying the room's largest chair without invitation. "But Providence has seen fit to deliver you safely to us, and for that we're grateful. Your uncle was a respected member of our community." "Thank you, Mayor Hollister," Lydia replied, observing the way his gaze swept over her uncle's papers, which she had deliberately left visible. "I look forward to continuing his work at the Chronicle." Something flickered in the mayor's expression, concern, perhaps, or wariness. "Admirable, most admirable, though of course, with your injuries, no one would think less of you for taking time to recover before plunging into business. Perhaps even considering whether newspaper work is suitable for a lady of your refinement." "Newspaper work has been my life since childhood, Mayor," Lydia responded pleasantly. "My father owned the Boston Sentinel. I grew up with ink in my veins, you might say." This information clearly surprised Hollister, who recalibrated his approach. "Indeed, how fascinating. Then you'll bring Eastern sophistication to our humble publication. Progress is my watchword, Miss Nelson, independence advancing into the future. I trust the Chronicle will support our town's growth and opportunities." "The Chronicle will report the truth, Mayor Hollister," Lydia stated, matching his smile with one of her own. "As my uncle did." The mayor's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. "Harmon had strong opinions about how things should be done. Not always practical opinions, if you understand my meaning." "I believe I do," Lydia replied, the exchange of pleasantries now barely disguising their mutual assessment. When the mayor finally departed, promising to send his wife to call once you're more settled, Lydia leaned back against her pillows, thoughtful. Hollister had revealed more than he intended: his concern about her continuing her uncle's editorial approach, his desire to control the newspaper's narrative about town development, and his underestimation of her because of her gender and injured state. All useful information for the battles that likely lay ahead. The afternoon brought Timothy Cooper back, eager to show Lydia the printing press and discuss the next edition. Unable to visit the Chronicle's office herself, Lydia worked with Timothy in her room, drafting a simple but dignified announcement of her arrival and intentions for the newspaper. "People need to know the Chronicle will continue as a voice for truth and progress," she explained to Timothy. "Not the mayor's version of progress, but genuine advancement that benefits all citizens." Timothy nodded enthusiastically. "Your uncle always said a newspaper should comfort the afflicted and afflict the comfortable." "Wise words," Lydia agreed, smiling at the young man's evident hero worship of her uncle. "Now, tell me more about these railroad surveys. Where exactly are they measuring?" For the next hour, they pored over maps of the surrounding area, with Timothy indicating the parcels that had changed ownership recently and the rumored routes for the railroad. A pattern began to emerge: land purchases clustered along two potential paths, one running directly through the heart of Independence and another skirting the northern edge of town. The northern route would be cheaper to build, Timothy explained. Flatter terrain, fewer bridges needed. But the town route would bring the station right to Main Street, which merchants prefer. "And who owns the land along each route?" Lydia questioned. Timothy's expression grew troubled. "That's what's strange, Miss Nelson. Some purchases are obvious businesses buying expansion room, that sort of thing. But others are hidden behind company names or lawyers from Sacramento. Your uncle was trying to trace the real owners." "And we'll continue that work," Lydia assured him, though she wondered how she would manage such investigations while bedridden. As if reading her thoughts, Timothy offered hesitantly, "Mr. Zane might help. He rides all over the county, knows the land better than most." And he helped your uncle sometimes, providing information. The suggestion surprised Lydia. Kieran Zane helped my uncle with his investigations. Timothy nodded. Mr. Zane doesn't say much, but he sees everything, and he owed your uncle some kind of debt, I think. The revelation added another layer to her impression of the enigmatic cowboy. What was Kieran's stake in these matters, and would he be willing to help her as he had helped her uncle? As dusk fell and Timothy departed, promising to return with the printed announcement for her approval, Lydia found herself watching the street through her window. Townsfolk hurried home for evening meals, lamps were lit in windows, and the saloon down the street began to glow with activity. This would be her home now, these streets, these people, this community with its hopes and conflicts. Despite her injuries and the unsettling questions surrounding her uncle's death, Lydia felt a growing determination. The Chronicle would continue its mission under her leadership, regardless of who might be displeased by that fact. A movement across the street caught her attention, a tall figure on horseback, recognizable even in the fading light. Kieran Zane sat motionless on his palomino, his gaze fixed on her window. When he saw her watching, he touched the brim of his hat in silent acknowledgement, then turned his horse and rode away. The brief exchange, wordless though it was, left Lydia with a curious sensation of anticipation. There was more to Kieran Zane than met the eye, and she intended to discover what lay beneath that controlled exterior. The next morning brought rain, drumming steadily against the windows and casting a gray pall over Independence. Lydia's leg throbbed in time with the raindrops, the change in weather intensifying her discomfort. Mrs. Abernathy provided willow bark tea for the pain and gossip for distraction. Saw Kieran Zane riding out early, the landlady remarked as she straightened Lydia's room. Man keeps odd hours. They say he still scouts sometimes for the army when they need someone who knows the back country. Is that unusual? Lydia asked, trying to sound merely conversational. Mrs. Abernathy shrugged. Most cowboys stick to their ranches, their herds. Zane's different, came here with nothing but his horse and saddle after the war, worked odd jobs till he proved himself with horses. Now every rancher wants him breaking their stock. She paused in her dusting. Keeps to himself, though. No family that anyone knows of, no sweetheart neither. The last observation was delivered with a sidelong glance that Lydia pretended not to notice. I'm grateful he happened to be near when the stagecoach crashed, she said neutrally. Providence, Mrs. Abernathy declared firmly. The Lord puts people where they're needed, Miss Nelson. Remember that. The day passed slowly, confined as Lydia was to her bed and chair. Timothy brought the printed announcement, which would appear in the next day's edition, and they worked on other stories for the paper. In the late afternoon, Dr. Pearson visited to check her injuries, pronouncing them healing well but warning that full recovery would take weeks. That leg needs time, Miss Nelson, he cautioned. No gallivanting about town until the bone knits properly. But I need to visit the Chronicle's office, meet people, investigate, Lydia began to protest. The doctor cut her off with a raised hand. The newspaper will wait, unless you fancy being a cripple the rest of your days. The blunt questions silenced her objections, though it didn't diminish her frustration. How could she fulfill her uncle's legacy, pursue the truth about questionable land deals, or even establish herself in the community while confined to a sick room? As twilight approached and the rain continued its steady fall, Lydia's spirits sank lower than they had since the crash. Pain and immobility wore at her customary determination, leaving her uncharacteristically despondent. A knock at her door roused her from these gloomy reflections. Expecting Mrs. Abernathy with dinner, she called a listless "come in." Instead, Kieran Zane entered, bringing with him the sense of rain and horses and the wider world beyond her four walls. He removed his dripping hat, revealing hair darkened by moisture. "Evening, Miss Nelson," he greeted, seeming to fill the small room with his presence. "Thought you might be going stir-crazy by now." The accurate assessment of her mood startled a laugh from Lydia. "Is it that obvious?" A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "Figured a woman bold enough to travel across country alone to run a newspaper wouldn't take kindly to being bedridden." "Your perception does you credit, Mr. Zane," Lydia acknowledged. I'm finding confinement rather challenging. Kieran nodded, producing a small package from inside his coat. Brought you something that might help. Curious, Lydia unwrapped the brown paper to find a small leather-bound book. Opening it, she discovered it was a journal, its pages blank and inviting. For your thoughts, investigations, whatever you need, Kieran explained, looking almost embarrassed by the gesture. Harmon always kept notes, said writing helped him think. Touched by the thoughtful gift, Lydia ran her fingers over the smooth leather. Thank you, it's perfect. She glanced up at him. Did you know my uncle well? Kieran moved to the window, looking out at the rain-slicked street. Well enough. He gave me a chance when others wouldn't, printed a piece I wrote once about wild horse management when the army was shooting mustangs as pests. He turned back to face her. Harmon believed everyone deserved a voice, even an ex-Confederate with no roots and no recommendations. You were friends, Lydia surmised. As much as anyone was friends with Harmon, Kieran acknowledged. He kept his own counsel, but he was fair. And he loved this town, wanted what was best for it, not just what was profitable for a few. The railroad, Lydia said, connecting the threads of their conversation. Kieran's expression sharpened. You've been asking questions. It's what newspaper people do, Lydia replied with a slight smile. Timothy tells me you helped my uncle with information sometimes. A long moment passed as Kieran seemed to consider his response. Finally, he pulled the room's single chair closer to Lydia's bed and sat, leaning forward with an intensity she hadn't seen before. There's something wrong with these land deals, he said quietly. Properties changing hands through front companies, surveyors working at night, meetings between the mayor and railroad men that nobody's supposed to know about. Do you think the railroad is bypassing independence? Lydia asked, recalling her conversations with Timothy. Kieran shook his head. I think it's coming through, but not where people expect. And I think certain folks stand to make fortunes based on inside information. He hesitated. Your uncle was close to proving it when he died. The implication hung heavily between them. You don't believe his death was natural, Lydia stated, voicing what had been growing in her own mind. Harmon had a weak heart, according to Doc, Kieran said carefully, but the timing was mighty convenient for some people. Lydia thought of the mayor's veiled warnings, the mysterious visitor Timothy had mentioned, the pattern of land purchases in her uncle's notes. If you're right, these are dangerous allegations. Which is why you should be careful, Kieran cautioned, especially now when you're vulnerable. His concern seemed genuine, but Lydia bristled slightly at the implication she couldn't handle herself. I appreciate your warning, Mr. Zane, but I didn't come west to shy away from difficult truths. Unexpectedly, Kieran smiled a real smile that transformed his serious features. Didn't think you did, Miss Nelson, just suggesting discretion while you're laid up. He stood, retrieving his still damp hat. When you're ready to continue your uncle's work, I'm willing to help. I know the land, the people. I can go places, ask questions that might be difficult for you. The offer was exactly what Lydia needed, yet she hesitated. Why would you take such a risk? These people could ruin you if they're as powerful as we suspect. Kieran's expression grew solemn. I owe Harmon, and I believe in what he stood for: truth, fairness. This town gave me a second chance. I want it to remain the kind of place that offers that to others. It was the most she'd heard him say at once, and Lydia sensed the conviction behind the words. This was a man of principle, despite his reticence. Then I accept your help, Mr. Zane, she said, extending her hand. Partners in investigation, he took her hand, his calloused palm warm against hers. Partners, he agreed, the word carrying a weight beyond its surface meaning. Their hands remained joined a moment longer than necessary, and Lydia felt an unexpected flutter in her chest at the contact. When Kieran finally released her hand and moved toward the door, she found herself reluctant to see him go. Will you visit again? She asked impulsively. He paused, hat in hand. If you'd like. I would, Lydia admitted. The days are long when one can't move about. Kieran nodded, understanding in his eyes. Then I'll come, and I'll bring news from beyond these four walls. After he departed, Lydia opened the journal he had given her, running her fingers over the blank pages. Then, with new determination, she began to write questions that needed answers, connections to be investigated, observations about independence and its citizens, On a fresh page, she wrote simply, Kieran Zane. Beneath it, she added, ally, friend, something more. The question surprised her even as she wrote it. But there was no denying the connection she felt to this enigmatic man who had saved her life and now offered to help her pursue the truth, whatever the risk. Over the next 2 weeks, as spring deepened across the Sierra foothills, Lydia's strength returned gradually. Her ribs healed enough that breathing no longer caused pain, and Dr. Pearson pronounced her ready for brief excursions using crutches, though her broken leg would need more time. These weeks also brought a deepening relationship with Kieran. True to his word, he visited regularly, bringing not only news but also small comforts, fresh wildflowers, a particularly fine apple, once even a chess set carved from pine that he claimed to have found gathering dust, but that she suspected he had made himself. Their conversations ranged widely from town gossip to philosophy, from their respective pasts to their hopes for the future. Lydia learned that Kieran had grown up on a small Texas ranch, the middle son of a hardworking couple who lost everything in the war. His parents had died of fever while he was fighting, his brothers had scattered to unknown fates. So I came west, he explained one evening as they sat playing chess near the open window. Figured I'd find something worth building a life around, and have you. Lydia asked, moving her bishop to capture his knight. Kieran studied the board, his expression thoughtful. Getting closer, he said finally, looking up to meet her eyes with an intensity that made her breath catch. For her part, Lydia shared stories of Boston society, her father's newspaper, and the scandal that had propelled her westward. Kieran listened without judgment, his quiet questions revealing an intelligence and perception that continually surprised her. Meanwhile, the investigation into the railroad dealings advanced slowly but steadily. Timothy brought records from the county office, which Lydia studied carefully. Kieran rode the countryside, observing survey markers and land improvements, sometimes speaking with farmers and ranchers about offers they'd received for their properties. Patterns emerged, pointing to a conclusion that troubled them both. The railroad would indeed come through Independence, but the station would be built on the northern edge of town, where a consortium of investors had quietly purchased large tracts of land at low prices. The value of those properties would soar once the railroad's plans were publicly announced, while businesses that had invested heavily in Main Street would suffer. And Mayor Hollister, Lydia asked one evening as she and Kieran reviewed their findings. Is he involved? Kieran nodded grimly. Up to his neck. His brother-in-law's law firm represents half the shell companies buying land along the northern route, and Hollister himself has been seen meeting with the head surveyor after hours. We need proof, Lydia mused, tapping her pencil against her journal. Records, testimony, something concrete enough to print. Getting it won't be easy, Kieran warned. These men are careful. But not infallible, Lydia countered. Everyone makes mistakes, we just need to find them. Her first official visit to the Chronicle's office came a few days later. Leaning on her crutches and supported by Timothy's anxious hovering, Lydia finally saw the place that would be her professional home, and once her leg healed, her residence as well. The newspaper occupied a modest building on a side street off Main, 2 rooms downstairs for the office and printing press, 2 rooms upstairs that had been her uncle's living quarters. The space was cluttered but clean, with the comforting smells of ink, paper, and machine oil that Lydia associated with her father's newspaper. It's perfect, she declared, taking in the ancient printing press, the battered desk piled with papers, the walls covered with past editions. This was familiar territory, a place where she knew her worth and purpose. Timothy beamed at her approval. Mr. Nelson would be pleased you feel that way. He loved this place. Over the next week, Lydia spent increasingly longer hours at the office, gradually taking full editorial control of the Chronicle. Her first major piece, an analysis of town development focused on the benefits of community input in planning, was carefully crafted to establish her journalistic credentials without directly challenging the mayor's faction. The response was immediate and divided. Letters arrived supporting her call for transparency, while Mayor Hollister personally visited to express his concern that a newcomer might not fully appreciate local customs and priorities. "I assure you, Mayor, I'm learning quickly," Lydia replied with perfect civility. "In fact, I find the patterns of land acquisition around town particularly educational." The mayor's florid complexion darkened further. "Business matters can be complex, Miss Nelson, easy for outsiders to misinterpret normal transactions." "Then I'm fortunate to have such knowledgeable local advisors," Lydia countered smoothly. After Hollister departed, Timothy whispered in awe, "You stood up to him. Not many do that." "Newspaper editors can't afford to be intimidated," Lydia replied, though in truth her heart was racing from the confrontation. "Now, let's get back to work on that land ownership piece." Later that evening, as Kieran escorted her back to the boarding house, she recounted the exchange with Hollister. "You've got him worried," Kieran observed, his hand supportive at her elbow as she navigated the uneven boardwalk with her crutches. "He'll be watching you more closely now." "Let him," Lydia said with more confidence than she felt. "We're close to the truth, I can sense it." Kieran stopped walking, turning to face her. In the soft glow of the street lamp, his expression was serious. "Lydia, these men have money and influence. If they realize how much we know, they might take action, legal or otherwise." It was the first time he had used her given name, the intimacy of it momentarily distracting her from his warning. "What are you suggesting? That we stop investigating?" "No," he said firmly. "That we be prepared for resistance, that we protect ourselves and our information." He hesitated, then added quietly, "that you understand the risks before we go further." Lydia studied him, touched by his concern but determined not to be deterred. "I understand the risks, Kieran. I also understand what's at stake for this town, for the people who have welcomed me, who depend on the Chronicle to be their voice." She shifted her weight on her crutches. "My uncle didn't back down, neither will I." For a long moment, they stood in silence, the evening breeze carrying distant piano music from the saloon and the scent of spring blossoms from nearby gardens. Then, unexpectedly, Kieran smiled, that rare, transformative expression that never failed to warm her. "Harmon would be proud," he said simply. "And so am I." The words, and the look that accompanied them, followed Lydia into her dreams, that night dreams not of danger and corruption, but of possibilities she had not allowed herself to consider before coming west. The breakthrough in their investigation came from an unexpected source. Mrs. Abernathy, who had taken to joining Lydia for afternoon tea in the Chronicle's office, mentioned casually that her nephew worked as a clerk for the land office in Sacramento. "Poor boy's overwhelmed with paperwork lately," she remarked. "Says he's been processing more transfers for Independence properties in the last 6 months than in the 5 years before." Lydia exchanged a significant look with Timothy. "Your nephew must have interesting insights into these transactions, Mrs. Abernathy." The landlady's shrewd eyes narrowed slightly. "He might, though discussing official business would be improper, of course." "Of course," Lydia agreed smoothly. "Though as a newspaper, we're always interested in patterns of development that affect our town. Perhaps your nephew would be willing to speak generally about trends he's observing." "For the public good," Mrs. Abernathy sipped her tea, considering. "Raymond has mentioned certain irregularities. Nothing illegal, mind you, but unusual." She set down her cup decisively. "He's visiting next Sunday. Perhaps you'd care to join us for dinner after church." "I would be delighted," Lydia replied, her pulse quickening at the potential lead. That evening, when Kieran arrived to escort her on what had become their habitual evening walk and exercise Dr. Pearson encouraged for her healing leg, Lydia could hardly contain her excitement. "Mrs. Abernathy's nephew may be our key," she explained as they made their slow way along the quieter streets of town. "If he has access to the original land records, he might be able to trace the real ownership of these shell companies." Kieran listened thoughtfully. "It's a good lead, but be careful. If Hollister has influence in Sacramento and men like him usually do, asking too many direct questions could put this clerk at risk." "I'll be discreet," Lydia promised. "But this could be the evidence we need, Kieran, proof of who really benefits from the railroad's route." They had reached the edge of town, where the neat grid of streets gave way to open country. The setting sun painted the distant mountains in shades of purple and gold, a sight that still took Lydia's breath away after a lifetime in the East. Beautiful, isn't it? Kieran murmured, following her gaze. I never imagined such vastness, Lydia admitted. In Boston, everything is contained, defined. Here, there's a sense of possibility. Is that why you stayed? Kieran asked. After the accident, you could have sold the Chronicle, returned east. The question startled her not because she hadn't considered it, but because she'd never seriously entertained the idea. I suppose I could have, she acknowledged. But from that first night when you found me, she hesitated, suddenly aware of how personal the conversation had become. I felt as though I was exactly where I needed to be. Kieran turned to face her, the dying sunlight gilding his features. Even with broken bones and corruption to fight, especially then, Lydia replied softly. When else does one discover what they're truly made of? Something shifted in Kieran's expression, admiration, perhaps, or a deeper emotion she wasn't ready to name. For a breathless moment, she thought he might step closer, might breach the careful distance they had maintained despite their growing closeness. Instead, he glanced at the darkening sky. We should head back. Night falls quickly here. The moment passed, leaving Lydia with a curious mixture of disappointment and anticipation. There was something building between them, something neither had acknowledged directly, but that seemed to grow stronger with each shared confidence, each evening walk, each quiet look. Sunday's dinner with Mrs. Abernathy's nephew proved as illuminating as Lydia had hoped. Raymond Perkins, a serious young man with a fastidious manner, was initially reluctant to discuss land office business. But after Lydia explained their concerns about transparency and community impact rather than specific transactions, he gradually warmed to the conversation. It's true that property around Independence has been unusually active, he admitted over apple pie. And yes, many purchases have been made through representative parties rather than direct buyers. Is that legal? Lydia asked innocently. Perfectly legal, Raymond assured her. But unusual in such volume, and he hesitated, glancing at his aunt. Raymond, if something improper is happening, you have a civic duty, Mrs. Abernathy prompted. The clerk sighed. There's nothing technically improper, but some of the paperwork has been expedited in unusual ways. Permits granted without the standard waiting periods, surveys approved without field verification. And who authorizes such exceptions? Lydia inquired, keeping her tone conversational. Normally, such decisions require multiple signatures, including the regional supervisors, Raymond explained. But recently, many have been approved solely by Mr. Garrett, who oversees railroad coordination. And Mr. Garrett has connections to Independence, Lydia prompted. Raymond shifted uncomfortably. I shouldn't say more. But if you were to examine who attended Sacramento State College between 1845 and 1850, you might find interesting associations. It was oblique but significant a thread to pull that might unravel the entire scheme. That evening, Lydia shared the information with Kieran as they sat in the Chronicle's office, the printing press silent on a Sunday night. Hollister went to Sacramento State, Kieran confirmed after considering the lead. It's mentioned in his campaign materials, his education being proof of his fitness for leadership. So he may have a college connection to this Mr. Garrett, who's expediting railroad-related permits, Lydia mused, making notes in her journal. We need to establish that link conclusively. The alumni records would show it, Kieran suggested, but they're not public. Lydia tapped her pencil thoughtfully. The college publishes an annual report that includes notable alumni achievements. The state library would have copies. Sacramento's a long journey for someone still on crutches, Kieran pointed out. Then perhaps someone else should make the trip, Lydia replied, giving him a meaningful look. Kieran's eyebrows rose. Me, in a library? I'm not exactly a scholarly type, Lydia. You underestimate yourself, she countered. Besides, no one would connect a horse trainer's visit to the state capitol with our investigation. After some persuasion, Kieran agreed to make the journey the following week. With his departure imminent, Lydia found herself unexpectedly anxious about the separation. In the months since the Stagecoach crash, Kieran had become a constant in her life, a source of strength, insight, and increasingly, emotional connection. The evening before he was to leave, they took their usual walk, venturing farther than usual as Lydia's mobility improved. The late spring air was fragrant with wildflowers, and fireflies had begun to appear in the gathering dusk. "I'll only be gone a few days," Kieran assured her, noticing her unusual quietness. "Timothy will look after you, and Mrs. Abernathy won't let anyone suspicious near the boarding house." "I'm not concerned for my safety," Lydia replied truthfully. "I'm just—" She hesitated, searching for words that wouldn't reveal too much of her heart. "I've grown accustomed to our conversations. The evenings will seem empty without them." Kieran stopped walking, turning to face her on the deserted lane. "Lydia," he began, his voice lower than usual, "these past weeks—" Whatever he intended to say remained unspoken as hoofbeats approached rapidly from behind them. They turned to see a rider approaching at speed. Timothy, his young face flushed with excitement or alarm. "Miss Nelson, Mr. Zane," he called, reining in beside them. "You need to come quickly." Someone broke into the Chronicle's office. The peaceful evening shattered. They hurried back to town as quickly as Lydia's crutches allowed. The newspaper office door stood ajar, its lock broken. Inside, drawers had been emptied, papers scattered across the floor. Lydia's desk had been thoroughly ransacked, and most disturbing of all, the leather portfolio containing her uncle's notes on the railroad investigation was missing. Who would do this? Timothy asked, his voice shaking as he surveyed the damage. "Someone who knows we're getting close to the truth," Kieran replied grimly, examining the broken lock. "Professional job, not some random theft." Lydia moved carefully through the chaos, assessing what had been taken and what remained. "They got my uncle's original notes, but not everything," she said finally. "I kept my journal at the boarding house, and you have copies of the key documents, Timothy." "Should we notify the sheriff?" Timothy asked uncertainly. Kieran and Lydia exchanged looks. Sheriff Benson was known to be closely allied with Mayor Hollister. "Let's clean up first," Kieran suggested diplomatically. "See exactly what's missing before making a report." As they restored order to the office, Lydia felt a strange mix of fear and determination. The break-in confirmed they were on the right track, and that someone was worried enough about their investigation to take direct action. "This changes things," Kieran said quietly when Timothy stepped outside to secure the broken door. "Whoever did this might not stop at property damage next time." "Are you suggesting we abandon the investigation?" Lydia asked, already knowing the answer. "I'm suggesting we accelerate it," Kieran replied, "and that we be very careful, starting with you not staying alone at the boarding house tonight." Before Lydia could respond, Timothy returned with unexpected news. "Mr. Zane, there's a man outside looking for you. Says it's urgent, something about wild horses being rounded up illegally on White River land." Kieran frowned. "That doesn't make sense. White River doesn't run wild herds." He moved to the window, peering out cautiously. "I don't recognize him." A chill ran down Lydia's spine. "It could be a trap to separate us. Or to get me out of town before I can travel to Sacramento," Kieran agreed, his expression hardening. "Either way, we need to be smart about this." In the end, they developed a plan. Kieran would return to White River Ranch as expected but would depart for Sacramento secretly before dawn. Timothy would stay with relatives outside town, bringing Lydia's journal and their remaining evidence with him for safekeeping. And Lydia would accept Mrs. Abernathy's standing invitation to move into her private quarters until her leg fully healed, an arrangement that would provide both company and protection. As they finalized these arrangements, Lydia felt the weight of what they had undertaken. This was no longer just about uncovering corruption, it had become potentially dangerous, with real consequences for all involved. "I never intended to put you at risk," she said to Kieran as he prepared to leave, the office now restored to some semblance of order. "I chose this path long before you arrived," he replied, his voice gentle but firm. "Harmon was my friend, and this town deserves better than men who profit from deception." He hesitated, then added, "Besides, some things are worth fighting for no matter the risk." The look that passed between them carried unspoken meaning. an acknowledgement of feelings that had grown beyond professional alliance or even friendship. For a brief moment, with Timothy busy outside, they stood alone in the quiet office, the air between them charged with things unsaid. "Be careful in Sacramento," Lydia whispered, suddenly fearful of all that might go wrong. In response, Kieran did something he had never done before. He reached out and took her hand, his calloused fingers enveloping hers. "I'll come back to you, Lydia," he promised, his amber eyes holding hers. "That's not negotiable." Then, before she could respond, he was gone, leaving her with the lingering warmth of his touch and the echoing certainty of his words. The next few days passed in a tense blur. Lydia moved into Mrs. Abernathy's private sitting room, explaining the arrangement as a practical solution for her continuing recovery. The landlady asked no questions, but installed additional locks on her doors and kept her late husband's shotgun conspicuously visible. Meanwhile, the Chronicle continued publishing, with Lydia carefully balancing standard local news with subtle hints about the importance of transparency in town development. She avoided direct accusations, but laid groundwork for the revelations to come. Timothy proved unexpectedly resourceful, using his network of young friends to gather information about comings and goings at the mayor's office and the movements of certain businessmen associated with the land deals. Through him, Lydia learned that an urgent meeting had been called at Hollister's home the night after the break, in a meeting attended by several prominent citizens with investments along the northern route. "They're worried," Lydia concluded, "which means we're on the right track." On the fourth day after Kieran's departure, with no word from him, Lydia was beginning to worry when a young boy delivered a letter to the Chronicle's office. The envelope contained a single sheet of paper with a brief message in Kieran's distinctive handwriting: "Found what we need. Returning tomorrow. Watch your back." Kate, relief flooded through her, followed quickly by renewed determination. Whatever Kieran had discovered in Sacramento must be significant. They were close to breaking the story wide open. That evening, as Lydia worked late at the Chronicle, finishing the layout for the next day's edition, an unexpected visitor arrived. Mayor Hollister entered without knocking, his usual florid bonhomie replaced by a tight-lipped tension. "Miss Nelson," he greeted, remaining near the door. "Working late, I see." "The news waits for no one, Mayor," Lydia replied evenly, subtly shifting papers to cover her notes on the railroad investigation. "What brings you by at this hour?" Hollister moved further into the office, his gaze sweeping the room assessingly. "Concern, Miss Nelson." "Simple concern. There's been talk of break-ins, suspicious activities. A young woman alone shouldn't take unnecessary risks." "Fortunately, I'm rarely alone," Lydia countered. "Timothy should return shortly, and Mrs. Abernathy is expecting me for a late supper." "Ah yes, your assistant." "Enthusiastic boy." Hollister's tone suggested this was not a compliment. "And I understand your friend Zane has left town. Business in Sacramento, I hear." The casual mention of Kieran's whereabouts confirmed Lydia's suspicions that they were being watched. She maintained a neutral expression. "Mr. Zane has many responsibilities at White River Ranch. I don't keep track of his movements." "Of course not." Hollister smiled thinly. "Though you've become quite friendly since your arrival, unusual given Zane's reputation for keeping to himself." "The Stagecoach accident created an unusual bond," Lydia said simply. "Mr. Zane saved my life." Hollister nodded, his expression thoughtful. Indeed, fortuitous that he happened to be nearby. He moved to examine the printing press, running his fingers along its metal frame. "Miss Nelson, I'll be direct. There are matters of town development currently in delicate negotiations, matters requiring discretion until fully resolved." "The railroad," Lydia stated, seeing no point in pretense. The mayor's head snapped up, his eyes narrowing. "Among other things." "Progress requires vision, Miss Nelson, and sometimes bold moves that might be misunderstood by those lacking the full picture. The people of Independence are quite capable of understanding, Mayor, if given all the facts." "Facts can be interpreted many ways," Hollister countered, his tone hardening. "Some interpretations benefit the community, others cause unnecessary division and alarm." He straightened, abandoning pretense. "Your uncle discovered this too late. I would hate to see you make the same mistake." The threat, thinly veiled though it was, sent a chill through Lydia. But she refused to be intimidated. Rising from her desk, she faced Hollister directly despite her crutches. "My uncle was a journalist of integrity, Mayor Hollister. He believed the people deserved the truth about matters affecting their lives and livelihoods." She held his gaze steadily. "I share that belief." For a long moment, they stood in silence, the tension palpable. Then Hollister smiled, a cold, calculating expression that never reached his eyes. "We all want what's best for independence, Miss Nelson. I hope you'll consider carefully what that truly means." He moved toward the door, pausing with his hand on the knob. "Oh, and if you do hear from Zane, tell him Mayor Holden in Sacramento sends regards. Old college friends, you know." With that parting shot, confirming the very connection they had suspected, Hollister departed, leaving Lydia shaken but more resolved than ever. The mayor had shown his hand both the threat and the inadvertent confirmation of his Sacramento ties. She needed to warn Kieran. But how, when he was already en route back to Independence? The answer came in the form of young Timothy, who returned moments after Hollister left. When Lydia explained the situation, his face lit up with unexpected confidence. "I can get a message to Mr. Zane," he assured her. "My cousin Jake rides for the Pony Express. He's headed east tonight and can watch for Mr. Zane on the Sacramento Road." "Timothy, you're a marvel," Lydia declared, quickly penning a warning note. "Make sure Jake understands the importance of this and the need for discretion." As Timothy hurried off with the message, Lydia gathered her materials and prepared to return to Mrs. Abernathy's. The confrontation with Hollister had left her uneasy, aware that the stakes had risen considerably. Whatever Kieran had discovered in Sacramento must be significant enough to prompt this direct attempt at intimidation. The next morning dawned clear and bright, belying the tension Lydia felt as she opened the Chronicle for business. Timothy had returned late the previous night, reporting that his cousin had successfully departed with her warning message. Now all they could do was wait, and hope Kieran received it before riding into potential danger. Around mid-morning, as Lydia worked on an editorial about community involvement in town planning, the office door opened to admit Dr. Pearson for her weekly examination. "That leg's coming along nicely," he pronounced after checking her splint. "Another couple of weeks and we might consider a walking cast." He packed his medical bag, then added casually, "Heard there was some excitement at White River Ranch last night. Seems someone tried to set fire to the stable." Lydia's blood ran cold. Was anyone hurt? "No serious injuries," the doctor assured her. "Ranch hands spotted it early. Strange business, though. White River's well-liked, no obvious enemies." But Lydia understood immediately it was another warning, another attempt to intimidate those connected to the investigation. She thanked the doctor and, as soon as he left, shared the disturbing news with Timothy. "They're escalating," she said grimly. "First the break-in, now arson. These men are desperate to protect their scheme." Timothy's young face was solemn. "What do we do, Miss Nelson?" "We publish what we know," Lydia decided. "Today, not waiting for the regular edition, a special bulletin detailing the suspicious land transactions and the railroad connection. We may not have all the pieces yet, but enough to raise legitimate questions." "Without Mr. Zane's Sacramento evidence?" Timothy asked doubtfully. "We'll present what we can verify independently," Lydia explained, already drafting the bulletin in her mind. "Public scrutiny is our best protection now. Once the questions are asked openly, Hollister and his allies will face community pressure for answers." They worked feverishly through the afternoon, compiling property records, tracking ownership patterns, and carefully wording their allegations to avoid direct libel while making the connections clear. By late afternoon, the special bulletin was ready for the press. As Timothy inked the type, Lydia felt a curious mixture of anxiety and exhilaration. This was journalism at its most essential, challenging power, demanding accountability, serving the public's right to know. Whatever came next, she was fulfilling the promise she had made to herself and to her uncle's memory. The printing press had just begun its rhythmic clanking when the office door burst open. Lydia looked up, expecting perhaps the mayor or sheriff come to make a final attempt at intimidation. Instead, Kieran Zane stood in the doorway, dusty from the road, his expression a mixture of urgency and relief at finding her safe. Behind him stood another man older, distinguished, wearing an expensive suit incongruous in the frontier setting. "Lydia," Kieran said, striding forward. "Are you all right? I got your warning." "I'm fine," she assured him, her heart lifting at the sight of him despite the tension of the moment. "Who's your companion?" Kieran glanced back at the well-dressed stranger. "This is Federal Marshal James Donnelly. He's here about the railroad fraud and possibly your uncle's death." The revelation stunned Lydia into momentary silence. A federal investigation. That suggested the corruption extended far beyond independence, perhaps to the highest levels of the railroad company itself. Marshal Donnelly stepped forward, his manner courteous but businesslike. "Miss Nelson, Mr. Zane has shared your findings with me. They corroborate evidence we've been gathering about irregularities in railroad land acquisitions across 3 counties." "Then you know about Mayor Hollister and his Sacramento connection?" Lydia asked, recovering her composure. "Hollister is just one player in a much larger scheme," the marshal confirmed, "but a significant one. His college friend Douglas Garrett has been facilitating fraudulent land deals for the Pacific Western Railroad's benefit and for their own considerable profit. And my uncle discovered this," Lydia stated, the pieces falling into place. Marshal Donnelly's expression grew solemn. "We believe so, yes. And while we can't prove his death was anything but natural, the timing is highly suspicious, particularly in light of a telegram we intercepted, sent from Sacramento to Independence the day before he died." "What did it say?" Timothy asked, abandoning the printing press to join the conversation. "Nelson problem requires immediate resolution. Proceed as discussed," the marshal quoted grimly. "Not conclusive evidence of foul play, but concerning enough to warrant investigation." Lydia sank into her chair, the implications overwhelming. Had her uncle been murdered to protect this scheme? The possibility, which she had considered intellectually before, now struck her with emotional force. Kieran moved to her side, his hand coming to rest supportively on her shoulder. "The marshal wants our help, Lydia. With what we've uncovered locally and his federal authority, we can expose the entire operation." "How?" she asked, looking up at him. "By proceeding with your bulletin," Marshal Donnelly explained. "But adding one crucial element, an announcement of federal investigation. That will prevent Hollister and his associates from destroying evidence while we secure warrants. It was the perfect journalistic coup, exclusive federal information combined with their local investigation. The Chronicle would break a story with implications far beyond independence, fulfilling her uncle's legacy in ways Lydia had never imagined. We'll need to move quickly," the marshal continued. "Once this is published, Hollister will know we're onto him." "The press is already inked," Timothy pointed out. "We could have bulletins on the street within the hour." Decisions made, they sprang into action. While Timothy and the marshal modified the bulletin to include the federal investigation angle, Kieran drew Lydia aside, his expression serious. "I was worried when I got your warning," he said quietly. "The fire at White River, Hollister's visit, they're getting desperate." "I know," Lydia acknowledged, "but we've almost won, Kieran, thanks to you." He shook his head. "Thanks to us. Your courage, your determination, you've changed this town, Lydia. Changed me too, if I'm honest." Something in his voice, in the intensity of his gaze, made her breath catch. "Kieran, not now," he interrupted gently. "We've got a newspaper to publish and corruption to expose, but after." He left the sentence unfinished, but his meaning was clear in the way his eyes held hers, in the gentle pressure of his hand still resting on her shoulder. The moment was broken by Timothy's excited call that the press was ready. Returning to the task at hand, they printed the bulletins, with Marshal Donnelly providing an official statement and seal that lent federal authority to their exposé. Within the hour, newsboys were distributing the special edition throughout Independence, its bold headline proclaiming, "Federal investigation reveals railroad fraud. Mayor Hollister implicated in scheme to deceive citizens." The town's reaction was immediate and dramatic. Crowds gathered on street corners, reading aloud from the bulletin. People hurried toward the mayor's office, demanding explanations. And at the Chronicle, a steady stream of citizens arrived offering additional information, confirmation of suspicious activities they had witnessed but not understood until now. Marshal Donnelly departed with deputies to secure documents from the mayor's office and homes of other conspirators, while Lydia, Kieran, and Timothy continued gathering statements from townspeople eager to share their experiences with the implicated officials. By nightfall, arrests had begun. Mayor Hollister was taken into custody, attempting to flee town, 2 valises of documents and cash in his possession. Several prominent businessmen were detained for questioning. And most significantly for Lydia, Marshal Donnelly returned with evidence suggesting her uncle's heart failure might indeed have been induced a partially empty bottle of a particular medicine known to cause cardiac arrest in excessive doses, found hidden in the mayor's study. "It's not conclusive," the marshal cautioned, "but enough to pursue a murder investigation alongside the fraud charges." As the excitement gradually subsided, and citizens returned to their homes to digest the day's extraordinary events, Lydia found herself alone with Kieran in the Chronicle's office. Timothy had gone to help distribute a second bulletin updating the arrests, leaving them in a moment of quiet after the storm. "I can hardly believe it's over," Lydia said, looking around the office that had become the epicenter of a scandal that would likely make headlines across the country. "Not over," Kieran corrected gently. "Just beginning. There will be trials, testimony. The town will need guidance navigating what comes next. The Chronicle's job is more important than ever." "Our job," Lydia emphasized. "I couldn't have done this without you, Kieran." He moved closer, his eyes reflecting the lamplight. "When I found you after that crash, I never imagined where it would lead. You were just a stranger who needed help." "And now?" Lydia asked softly. Kieran reached out, his hand cupping her cheek with a tenderness that belied his strength. "Now you're the bravest, most remarkable woman I've ever known. The woman I've fallen in love with, against all my better judgment." The declaration, though perhaps not entirely unexpected given the growing closeness between them, still took Lydia's breath away. In the months since the Stagecoach crash, Kieran had become essential to her partner, protector, friend. But love. Yes, she realized that was indeed what had blossomed between them, nurtured by shared purpose and mutual respect. "Your better judgment has questionable taste," she teased gently, her heart racing. "Falling for a stubborn, reckless Easterner who arrived in a broken stagecoach and immediately entangled you in scandal. Best decision I ever made," Kieran replied, his smile transforming his face. "Staying until dawn that first night when I could have left you with the others. Something told me you were worth waiting for." "And now," Lydia whispered, overwhelmed by the emotion of the moment, by all they had experienced together. In answer, Kieran leaned down and kissed her gently at first, then with growing passion as she responded. His arms encircled her waist, supporting her as her crutches clattered forgotten to the floor. In that moment, her injuries, the investigation, the tumult of the day all faded against the reality of finally being in Kieran's embrace. When they eventually parted, both breathless, Kieran rested his forehead against hers. "I love you, Lydia Nelson." Not sure exactly when it happened, maybe that first night under the stars, maybe watching you stand up to Hollister, maybe seeing you fight for this town like it was your own from the beginning. "I love you too," Lydia replied, the words coming easily, naturally. "And I think I've been falling since you bandaged my wounds and stayed until dawn, a stranger caring for me with such gentleness." The future stretched before them, uncertain in its details, but suddenly rich with possibility. There would be challenges, the aftermath of the corruption scandal, rebuilding community trust, perhaps even danger from those whose schemes they had exposed. But they would face it together, their partnership now expanded to encompass this deeper connection. In the years that followed, the story of Kieran Zane and Lydia Nelson became part of Independence's folklore, how a stagecoach crash brought together a solitary cowboy and a determined newspaperwoman, how they exposed corruption that might have destroyed the town, and how they built a life together that embodied the very best of frontier spirit. The Chronicle flourished under their joint stewardship, with Lydia's editorial voice complemented by Kieran's deep knowledge of the land and its people. When they married the following spring, once Lydia's leg had fully healed and the major corruption trials had concluded, it seemed the entire town turned out to celebrate. They made their home in the renovated rooms above the newspaper office, gradually expanding into adjacent space as their family grew, first with twin boys who inherited their father's quiet strength and their mother's fierce determination, then with a daughter whose journalistic instincts manifested almost from the cradle. Independence prospered too, although not in the way Mayor Hollister had envisioned. The railroad eventually came, but with a route determined by proper surveys and fair negotiations, benefiting the community as a whole rather than a select few. The town grew steadily, maintaining its character while embracing necessary change. On cool evenings, Kieran and Lydia often walked to the spot where they had first acknowledged their feelings for each other, now marked by a small memorial to Harmon Nelson and his legacy of journalistic integrity. There, with the mountains painted gold by the setting sun, they would reflect on the strange twists of fate that had brought them together. Do you ever wonder what would have happened if the stagecoach hadn't crashed? Lydia asked once, her hand secure in Kieran's as they stood beside the memorial. He considered the question seriously, as was his way. "I believe some things are meant to be one way or another," he said finally. "If not the crash, then some other circumstance would have brought us together." He smiled down at her, the years having softened but never diminished the love in his eyes. "Though I'm grateful it happened when it did. Can't imagine my life without you in it." "Or without the Chronicle," Lydia added, glancing back toward town where the newspaper office windows glowed with evening light. "Or Independence." "Our home," Kieran agreed simply, "worth every risk we took." As twilight deepened around them, they began their walk back to town, to their family, to the life they had built from the unlikeliest of beginnings. And Lydia reflected, not for the first time, on how a moment of catastrophe, a stagecoach careening off a mountain path, had ultimately led to the greatest happiness she had ever known. For in Kieran Zane, she had found not just a man who had bandaged her wounds and stayed until dawn, but one who had remained steadfast through every dawn that followed, partner, protector, love of her life in a land of vast horizons and endless possibilities.